There's no way to say that the Quran as you have it today, it's exactly how the Prophet was reciting it. It is unique, but it is not miraculously unique. Yes, there are many grammatical inconsistencies in the Quran. If they were written by a person, by a poet, they would go after him. It's like, oh, this is wrong. You don't justify. But because it's the Quran, you have to justify. It cannot be wrong.
Dr. Shady Nasser, how are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to meet you, and not in person, on screen. And looking forward to our conversation. Yes.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that you joined me. I'm very, very happy that you accepted my invitation.
No problem. Me too. No problem.
Yeah. Could you very briefly, for those who are not aware, in a few words, introduce yourself and your backgrounds?
Sure. I mean, very shortly, I teach Arabic and Islamic studies at Harvard. I also took my PhD from there, and I mostly teach and work on things related to, let's say, 7th, 8th century Arabic language, including the Quran, transmission of texts, Arabic poetry. So that's shortly what I work on. Yeah.
That is respectable. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Okay, so what I want to do today is I basically briefly talked to you about this beforehand. I want to ask you 10 questions that I designed for our quest today. I would like to hear your professional opinion in short answers and long answers to these questions. You can let me know about the quality of these questions as we go. I want to ask you a clarification question before we start, and then we'll see what where we can go from there.
Sure.
So our topic is the Quran and how the Quran came into existence, the history and the authenticity of the Quran, and related questions. So the very first thing that I want to clarify before we get into our main questions is, I know this is not a work of academia, but I want to ask this question for the record, just to tackle a certain misconception that many people may have, whether they come from a perspective of belief or disbelief in Islam. Is it possible for academics to professionally verify and conclude that the Quran is the word of Allah or the word of a God?
No, that's the short answer. I don't think in academia or in research, researchers are interested in these questions. Of course, there are academics who are Muslims, academics who are not Muslims. They have their own beliefs, but I don't think such questions are tackled because it's, at the end of the day, it's not something that you can prove or disprove, right? So I do remember I was told that 100 years ago or before, probably around this time, in the libraries, when they were in the Western libraries in Europe, when they were cataloging the Quran, they would put author Muhammad instead of an author, right? I was told that. So, but then things changed, and you stopped having this kind of label in the catalogs. So, because things progress, it's not because they want to not hurt Muslims' feelings about that, but it's really academic studies progress to the point that it's really pointless to tackle this question. You want to believe it's the word of God, it is the word of God. You don't want to believe in that, it's not. So really, there's nothing that you can prove or disprove about it. So.
I remember reading in some early records one of the first critiques of Islam and Muhammad. I fail to remember the name of the author. It's a Christian scholar. I'm sure you have dealt with the topic. But he for example, in his criticism of Islam, which he refers to as something different. He doesn't call it Islam, but he basically classifies it as a heresy as a Christian heresy.
Right.
And he basically also says Muhammad wrote a book in which he wrote this and this and this. So it's very common to find in these early critiques and texts that they say Muhammad wrote down this and that. So
right. I mean,
that's the perspective.
It's perfectly fine, and even respected Orientalists in a sense of their work. They never thought that the Quran was a revelation. It's Muhammad who wrote the book, and it's perfectly fine. Nöldeke, the greatest, one of the greatest German Orientalists in that sense, and he was referring to the early period as Muhammad's creative period in the earlier surahs, and then he started to lose his creativity with the later Medinin chapters. The verses got longer, repetitive, etc. And everyone respects Nöldeke and his work, including Muslims, right? So at the end of the day, it's your own beliefs, what you want to believe about the Quran, whether it's the word of God or revelation or not. I think academia is beyond this. So the short answer is no. And I gave you the long answer if it's satisfactory. So.
That's a very insightful answer, honestly. Yeah. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Okay, I want to proceed with the first of 10 questions that I have planned for today, which is, according to the Islamic tradition and according to academia surrounding the history of the Quran, did Muhammad have a physical Quran, or did he express the intention to create a physical Quran? If you can give a short answer and a longer answer to this.
Right. The short answer is it's very difficult to say because things from the early period are different from how things progressed in the later period. So most probably, probably in the early period, there was no intention of having a physical text. And then in the later period, probably there became an intention to have a physical text. And the reason for that is that let's say the early period, which we refer to as the early Meccan period, the objectives of Islam as a new religion was very different from the objectives of Islam in the later period, right? So in the early period, you want to convert the pagans, you want to convince them of the new religion. In the later period, you already have a core of Muslims, and now you are trying to set new rules for the new community, almost starting a new state. And when you have a new state, you do need a physical text.
Yeah.
Okay. So the short answer is it depends on the period. It depends from whether you are dealing with early Islam or later Islam. Islam during the life of the Prophet, not over the centuries. So we have accounts now. Getting to the longer answer, unless you have
that's fine.
Question. Yeah. So the longer answer or some of the details is that in the tradition we do have accounts about the Prophet having scribes. It's almost verifiable, right? That he had scribes. There are many accounts about that. So if he had scribes, it means that he had some intention to write down, maybe not the whole text, some parts of it, some verses, maybe important chapters, I don't know. There are accounts of him trying to tell people to reorganize verses, put this verse here, remove this from there, right? There are also, throughout the whole Quran, there are references to the pre-Islamic codices, pre-Islamic, right? The Bible, the sheets of Abraham, of Moses. So if you are starting again a new religion and you have this concept that religions before you, they also had scriptures. So you also want to have a scripture as well.
Yeah, yeah. I guess one thing that is confusing is that when you look into the Islamic tradition, you find the reports of the compilation of the Quran after the death of Muhammad.
Right.
And what you also find in the report is the quote, how can I do, or how could I do something that the Prophet himself did not
exactly
do or intend to do?
Correct. Exactly. So this is a problem when you have competing traditions. So you have traditions, and not only that, I mean, even the collection of the report of the collection of the Quran, the first one, how this companion, he was going around trying to get the Quran from the hearts of man, from camel shoulders, from leaves, etc. If the Prophet already had some kind of collection, why don't you go and consult it, right? And there's no record in the collection that I went and consulted this proto collection of the Prophet, right? It gives you a very different idea of how the Quran was at least memorized or scattered among people. So it is a problem. How do you bring these competing traditions together? And there are also reports that some of the wives of the Prophet, that they had a kind of proto-codices as well. Right? Aisha had, it seems, a codex according to one of the traditions. His companions, they had some kind of codices, not necessarily full-fledged codices, but at least something. Right, so it is an issue when you are trying to bring all these accounts together, and that's why usually Muslim scholars, they tend to focus more on chains of transmission of these reports. So, okay, well, this report has a better chain of transmission, so I will consider it more authentic than the other one. Or you try to come up with some kind of harmonizing these traditions, which is very common in the tradition. So
thank you so much for that. My second question will be kind of, you will see that the questions may a little bit overlap with each other, or might have been answered in a way or another, or it might go a little bit that way. But my second question would be, can it be confirmed with certainty that the content and or the text of the Quran that we have today was recited by Muhammad?
Again, the short answer is no. We don't have a time machine to go back and see what he was reciting. Okay. The short answer is no. There's always a probability issue. Okay, so there's no 100%, there's no 0%. It's always in between.
So we can never go beyond reasonable doubt. We can never.
No, you cannot. I mean, the best you could do is you say 99%. There's no way to say that the Quran as you have it today, it's exactly how the Prophet was reciting it. It's impossible, especially that when you have so many traditions that tell you otherwise.
Thank you. That's
from within the tradition itself, right? So take, for example, you heard of abrogation, right? So this is a common thing in the tradition. You have verses that abrogate other verses, not just the legal abrogations, just the verses completely taken out of the text. So at a certain point, these verses were recited, allegedly, by the companions, right? But then at a certain time, they were abrogated.
This is actually an interesting topic to quickly dwell on. When we talk about abrogation, there is much controversy about it, since it is a controversial topic. It is one that might go into very problematic directions.
Right.
But we talk about the nature of abrogation, and there are different kinds of abrogation, apparently. In a way, we could say that verses that exist but were revealed later might abrogate rules that are revealed in verses that were revealed earlier, but that also still exist. But we also, but there is also the concept of verses existing in the past and then getting lost or being removed in favor of new verses that come into existence. This is also a form of abrogation that is accepted.
Correct. So there are three forms of abrogation accepted. More generally, there are very few scholars who rejected that, but let's say there is a consensus that the three types are accepted. So the first one, which you mentioned, both verses exist in the text. One abrogates the other. Some scholars put it this way: it's not really abrogation, but one is general and the other one is specific. So it's again one way to get over the issue of abrogation. The second part, the one which you also mentioned, is the text is removed, but the rule is still there, such as the stoning for adultery. And the third type is that both the rule and so the text is removed and the rule is also removed.
Okay, so we have no trace of it. It is just
right. Gone. So both the rule and the text are abrogated. So these three types, and there are examples of several examples of each type. And yes, the abrogation is generally accepted by most scholars from different legal schools.
Can you give us very short examples, like one or two of that kind?
Yeah, for the third one, for example, the suckling, it's called the 10 sucklings. So this was supposed to be 10, and it was abrogated. The text was abrogated. It was mentioned there, and the rule is also abrogated. The second one is the stoning, as we said, and the first one, there are many of them. The alcohol, the fighting verse. There are also verses which do not have legal rulings, that they seem to be also abrogated or removed from the text. Some scholars put it also in the third category. There's one which says, if man if man would have a valley of silver or gold, it will not fill their stomach, something like that. It doesn't really have a legal ruling, but it's a verse which allegedly was also abrogated. So
I see. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, so the point I was making about abrogation is that if we go by these traditions, these verses were Quran at a certain point, right? But then again, if we follow the tradition, they were abrogated later on. So at a certain point, they were Quran, but then at another point in time, they ceased to be Quran. And my point is, if they were Quran at a certain point, they were recited by people, by the Prophet and by the companions. But then they stopped reciting them later on, which brings me back to your question, is that's one angle to even handle the question, is that, of course, the Quran we have now, it's very difficult to say it's the same, exactly the same text that people were reciting 1400 years ago. Not to mention variant readings, codices of the companions, are different arrangements of verses. So yeah, this is why it's very challenging to say, well, it's exactly the same that the Prophet was reciting, because there are many traditions that tell you otherwise.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. The third question would be, can it be verified that the first Quran, the first physical Quran that came into existence, compiled, is identical in content to the Quran that we have today?
Content?
Not in text, not in variants, just in content.
So before it was put into a text, or after?
After. So the first Quran that
right.
that was compiled and physically came into existence as a book. Can it be verified that that book is identical to the Quran that we have today?
Well, not identical 100%, but very, very close.
Okay.
Right. So we still had competing traditions of the other codices by the companions. Ibn Mas'ud had a codex, Ubay had a codex, which were different. And all this is reported in the tradition. So there are sometimes differences in chapters and syntax. More or less, they follow the same structure, but there are differences. So you can't say it's 100% all the codices were similar. No one says that. However, the printed Qurans we have today, they are very similar. Almost, we can go to the 90% probabilities, 99% similar to I hate percentages and probabilities. They don't tell you anything.
I understand that.
When you hear 99%, okay, what about the 1%? But they are very similar to what Muslims report, even without seeing manuscripts. We don't need manuscripts, okay? They are very similar to what Muslims reported about their own codices 1,300 years ago, right? The Uthmanic Codex. Now, what was happening before that, God knows best.
We don't know, yeah.
Okay. We don't know. We don't have manuscripts. Again, as I said, we don't really need manuscripts because Muslims actively reported about that. And they themselves say that the codices were different.
We have very much gone into this. My fourth question is, we have basically implicitly answered this question already, but my fourth question was going to be, can it be proven beyond reasonable doubt that the compilation of the Quran was done accurately?
The short answer, we can't know, right? So what does it mean accurately? Again, so what does it mean? What is accurate and what's not accurate? So how could it be that we have done this process correctly? Right? So you need the result needs to match the goal. Okay, so our goal is to collect the Quran. So did we collect the Quran exactly as the Prophet was reciting it? We don't know. The arrangement of the chapters, according to a consensus by Muslim scholars, it was done. The companions decided the arrangement.
What if we just focused on the content instead of the literary aspect, the arrangements or all of that?
Right.
What if it came to the content? We could also not say about the content that we can verify that it was done accurately. Right?
So the content, it's highly just studying the syntax of the Quran. Okay, just from a linguistic perspective, it's very difficult to say that there are verses or portions of the text that they don't belong there. Despite the fact that there are different styles in the early period and the later period, the register of the text is very similar.
Okay.
Now, there are scholars who did study this from a syntactical perspective. And I think Behnam Sadiqi had an article on that. He's studying particles and the distribution of particles in the syntax of early text and later text. And there are some conclusions to say, well, the author of this portion of the text could be different from the author of that portion of the text. So there are still people who do study this kind of thing. But to say that there are portions of the text that do not belong there, it's very difficult to prove.
Okay.
There's really there's hardly any portion of the text that you could read if you are familiar with the text that you would say, oh, well, this is completely out of context. There are problems with verses in which they were put in the chapters where sometimes you feel they are out of context. Okay, the verses. So, okay, what is this verse doing here? And it's very clear. I mean, this is a problem tackled by exegetes. They're trying to understand what is the relationship of this verse to that verse. Sometimes the pronouns completely shift. The story completely shifts.
One of the problems that I have when I read the Quran, I read it many times through, and I still read it on occasion in different parts again and again. And what I often encounter and criticize, sometimes severely, is that it seems that when you read through the book from the beginning to the end, it doesn't seem like it consistently stays on. It is not focused.
No, I mean you are right, but maybe it wasn't supposed to.
Okay.
It would be very surprisingly to read the Quran as if you are reading the Bible. I mean, that's one of the problems we have in teaching the Quran. It's very easy to teach the Bible. You go from chronologically, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Genesis, Exodus, it's just, you go, it's smooth, it's a story. The
Mm-hmm.
Quran is not a story. It's not supposed to be a historical record.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's selections of liturgical text being recited, put together. Some chapters make perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a trend in the past 20 years where people are doing surah studies, how the verses are connected to one another.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue is that you have to understand that the Quran came in a period where composition and books were not the norm or the custom.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same thing with Arabic poetry. If you read early Arabic poetry, read it in translation. There are many translations. It's the same thing. It doesn't follow a story from beginning to end. You would have verses scattered and just being compiled in one poem.
I could, based on this idea, say that the Quran was a product of its time, but this would not necessarily be acceptable, an acceptable statement to many.
It is a product of its time. So why would it not be acceptable? A statement, you mean from your perspective or from?
No, I mean, to me, this would be a completely acceptable statement. I mean, the Quran was naturally a product of its time, but from the perspective of a believer, it wouldn't necessarily be an acceptable thought to say that it was a product of its time. It would. One would rather think that it was not a product of its time. It was rather a perfect arrangement, divinely ordained for all times. And,
of course, there is a trend also in the tradition, not all of it, that the Quran is old. It's already written in the preserved tablet, and I believe this tradition very well. So yes, there is also a tradition in the a trend in the Islamic tradition that say, well, everything was ordained, everything was predetermined, the text is perfect as is. But again, these opinions, they don't have a, they are just, let's say, trends or opinions by scholars out of piety, out of trying to polish the narrative. But Muslim scholars, exegetes, etc., they already notice that most of the Quran, it is a product of its time. No one escapes from that reality, including the way it was arranged. And also, we have to pay attention to how thoughts about Islam by Muslims it changed over time. The concerns of Muslims in the early period are very different from the concerns of Muslims in the later period.
Yeah, I see that.
In the early period, and throughout the whole Quran and traditions, the Prophet is struggling to get divine revelation. He's even struggling with the devil. But speaking of abrogation, there are also many opinions that abrogation doesn't necessarily have to do with abrogation. It's about the devil sometimes inspiring, or inspiring is the wrong word, but trying to put some verses, doing waswasa, right?
It's a very controversial topic that we have had.
Yeah, but it was very normal in the early period. So you read early exegetes and opinions by scholars. That's what it meant. We are guarding the Quran from the interference of the devil. You are a true prophet. Don't worry. This is a speech to Muhammad, right?
Yeah.
But then in the tradition later on completely almost switched the narrative that the prophet he doesn't commit mistakes.
Yeah. There is a very zealous opposition to that entire idea, especially in today's time, by certain people that no, that was a misunderstanding. It is impossible that the devil interfered in the revelations.
Correct.
Muhammad was completely free from such things. The revelation was perfect. But in the early accounts, we see that there were what came to be known as the Satanic verses.
The Satanic verses.
Yeah.
The Satanic verses, the interference of the devil, and even it's when the prophet was not receiving revelation, he would get
very depressed,
confused, desperate. But then the narrative changes later on. because Muslims start to have a new understanding or different understanding of how things were. So again, it all depends which period you are focusing on, which period you are trying to understand, and to differ from one time to another. So
thank you so much. This was very wholesome. Moving on to question number 5. Are you okay with everything so far?
Yes.
Okay, fine, fantastic. Question number 5 would be, this might be a little bit a question of polemics and controversy. You may answer it as you wish. You may think it's not entirely relevant. But if it were suggested that the Quran and its backstory may very well be an invention by people, and that this book was not, in fact, delivered by a character named Muhammad, do we have proper evidence to refute that with certainty?
To refute that the Quran was invented by a person or persons other than Muhammad.
Yeah.
It goes both way. I mean, also we answered that shortly before, is that we don't know what happened before Uthman or before the collection of the codices. Okay, so it might be, if we want to talk objectively, okay, so it might be this person who was called Muhammad, or it could be another person, but it's very difficult also to say, well, there was a group of people who came up with the Quran out of nothing, and then they told the whole community, oh, look, we have this Quran. It was revealed to a prophet called Muhammad, and we have it, and people never heard about that before. Especially that Islamic history teaches us that Muslims never agreed on anything, right? And they have been
fighting. There was much schism from the very beginning.
From the very beginning, since the Prophet died, and even before he died, there are many factions within Islam, and each faction has its factions. So many people have different objectives, trying to prove or disprove something about the prophecy, about the Quran. So it's very difficult to say, well, the Umayyads came, and this is something that was mentioned by Wansbrough 50, 60 years ago in his book. That was a narrative that the Quran was collected 60, 70 years by the Umayyads, and then it was distributed, okay, from high above. It's very unlikely to believe this narrative, because there are many people who were opposing the Umayyads and who still had copies of the Quran, and they had their own Quran. So if you really need to go after this narrative, you need a lot of evidence and arguments to support it.
And the Umayyads were surrounded by controversy from their rise to their decline and beyond. And
they were not popular by all means. They were not even popular, including Sunni Muslims, not just Shia Muslims. So there are many people who we already have records of people during that time who already have Qurans. Now, what kind of Quran, what kind of fragments, what kind of arrangement, chapters, that's again difficult to say. But the concept that there was a Quran, that this Quran came to a person called Muhammad, that they called a prophet, it's a narrative that is very prevalent in Islamic history by different Islamic factions and groups.
In my personal opinion, I mean, I don't think it is. This would not be a question that I personally would ask, because in my opinion, it is very unlikely that the Quran was kind of made up out of thin air without a character named Muhammad at its core. I would think that it is the best possible explanation that Muhammad did indeed exist, that he did indeed recite or dictate at least most or parts of the Quran that we have today. What I would question is who Muhammad was and his intentions and all that. But this is a question that is in existence. So I thought it's relevant.
That's perfectly a legitimate question, and there are people who work. Look, there are two. Sorry to digress about this point a little bit, but there are two lines of investigation here. So you have one line, people trying to understand Islam within its context, late antiquity, who Muhammad was there a Muhammad? These are all, what kind of person he was. Was he really a prophet? Was he receiving something, or was he just a politician? It's legitimate line of investigation. Maybe he was receiving revelation from aliens, and Jibril was a hologram, and the Buraq was a starship. There are some people who wrote some, not in academia, but if you read Islamic history on that light, you would be amazing. It's almost science fiction, right?
That is a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you read these narratives when the prophet saw Gabriel, he was stretching from sky to earth. You think, oh wow, it's a hologram, okay? Hearing voices, maybe he was, I don't know, zooming, right? And someone was zooming with him and teaching him the Quran. I'm making things up now, but I'm saying that if we prove that, if someone can, okay, well, we prove that the Quran came from Martians or from aliens, this doesn't help me to understand how Muslims understood the Quran in the past 1400 years.
Exactly, yeah.
Because they never thought about this. So it helps the other line of answer. Okay, we understand the origins of the Quran. We knew where it came from, but how does that help me understand how Muslims understood the Quran 1200 years ago, right?
Perfect. Nice.
So that's how I would put it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. My next question would be, this is the sixth question on my list, would be, I know you will have a problem with the word miraculous here, but I'm trying to put it in a context that we can evaluate it from a academic, professional perspective.
Which doesn't occur in the Quran, by the way, the word miraculous.
Okay. So okay. I didn't actually go into that.
I mean, the whole notion of ijaz, it just came later, but it's not a, the term isn't there. So, yeah.
So the question would be, can the Quran be considered unique, miraculously unique in terms of its literary qualities and its content? Is it incomparable to other texts?
It is unique, but it is not miraculously unique. Okay, so every text is unique. It's not just because it's the Quran. The collection of poetry by Mutanabbi is also unique. For example, a famous Arab poet. Every text is unique, but the Quran is definitely unique. That there are no similar texts in terms of content and style, more or less. Style and how it was compiled, and not necessarily the register of Arabic, but just its style. Now, miraculous, again, it's a very loaded word, and not all Muslim scholars, not just talking about lay Muslims, thought that the style of the Quran was miraculous. Again, the concept developed over time. There are many Muslim scholars who thought that the Quran is not miraculous from a stylistic point of view, but the miraculous aspect is that God prevented people from imitating it. Okay, so that's.
What if we change the wording from miraculously unique to superior or sublime? So can the Quran be considered superior in terms of literary qualities and content to any other book out there?
I wouldn't say superior, but I would say that the Quran stylistically, it's written, composed in a very high register of Arabic. It is used on the same level as Arabic poetry. For grammar, textual examples to prove things related to language, philology, etc. Early Muslims, they were not quoting the Quran to prove scientific phenomena or mathematical phenomena. They were only using it for linguistic issues. Okay. So yes, the Quran is written in high register. Whether it's superior or not, it's again up to there are many scholars, Arab scholars, who didn't think that the Quran stylistically is superior to other compositions. There are other people who thought it was superior. It's not really a clear issue. I mean, it took more than 400 years for Muslim scholars to come up with somehow a framework of what inimitability, stylistic inimitability. It took 400 years for someone to come and frame that in a theory of semantics and philology, etc. So it's not really, you read something, oh, well, this is miraculous, or this is pure. So what's miraculous about it? You have to feel it. You have to know Arabic. Okay, well, I know Arabic, but I still can't feel it. Well, it's very subtle. It's not really something you can put your finger on.
This would be connected to the next question, which is the seventh question that I have on my list. Is something that I deal with, that I have dealt with a few times, I would say, before. But if I were to write a competing book today, considering that the Quran makes a challenge and it says if they are truthful, then let them produce something like it, or let them produce something better. If I were to write a competing book today, would it be possible to say that this is objectively, so my book is objectively not equal to or better than the Quran?
No, because you will need 400 years for people to study your book in order to reach, and then by that time the Quran would have 2,800 years of people studying it, and it will always it's not going to happen. I mean, there's a famous Arab poet and writer. He wrote a competing book in the mid-4th century. That would be 10th century. His name is Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri, very famous, one of like Shakespeare in English. And he wrote a thick book, imitating the style of the Quran. It's published, it's available. It's called Al-Fusul wal-Ghayat. If people read Arabic on your channel and want to check it out, very eloquent. It's excellent masterpiece. And they asked him, what happened? They are making fun of him after he wrote it and published it. So what happened to your Quran? Why didn't it become famous? He said, well, it wasn't polished in mosques for 400 years.
Wow.
Right? And this is 10th century. So the point is, issues of superiority in style, it's not going to be an objective criterion where someone, oh, look, I produced something. People will always poke holes in whatever you write. And there's no really objective criteria to say, well, this verse or this poem is better than the other poem.
Yeah. So my criticism of that was, for example, that I find the challenge unreasonable or incoherent, if I may say, because even if I did intend to, and I don't intend to do this, but even if I did intend to write something down today that I would think is a competition to the Quran, then no matter how good it is, no matter how good I think it is, no matter how good people think it is, people who value the Quran as the sublime book will always be able to say, no, your book is worse than the Quran because of this and this and this. And there's an endless supply of reasons to come up with why.
You will need time. You will need 1,000 years of scholarship on your book to reach this level, right? Yeah. So let's say the Bible, it has hundreds, thousands of years of studies on it. But then where the comparison stops at language. Well, the Bible or Old Testament, they are not as eloquent as the Quran. Well, of course they are not, because they are in translation. So the same thing goes with the Quran. If you translate it, it loses everything, right? Now, how they were in the original language, that's not, but I don't think they make the claim that they are syntactically and from a literary perspective that they are miraculous. Or inimitable. And also the Quran, when it produces, there are also many problems with that challenge. Okay, produce a book like it or a chapter like it, but it doesn't specify from which perspective. Okay,
That's the thing. If you set a challenge without setting the rules
right. So
of the challenge, then there is no
and
challenge.
that's what Muslim scholars debated. So it wasn't, again, the later narrative is all about the miraculous and inimitable nature of the text of the Quran. But also this wasn't the case early on. I mean, you see in the past, I would say 150 years, because this argument started to lose favor.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because many Muslims can't read the Quran in Arabic. 95% of them.
Mm-hmm.
They are not Arabs. Even Arabs who can read the Quran, they only understand the simple chapters. But even educated Arabs can't read it unless they really have decent education in Arabic to read it and appreciate it. So you started to have this shifting narrative towards other miraculous issues in the Quran, mathematics, science, astrology, to support the argument that it's miraculous all over, not just syntax.
Mm-hmm.
Early scholarship didn't pay attention to that. It was only focusing on syntax because people had a stronger connection with the language, with the culture, with the text, and they were not thinking about numbers and astrology, medicine, all this stuff. Yeah.
Moving on to a related question, the eighth question on my list is, the Quran says in chapter 5, verse 15, among others, that it is a clear book. And of course, it is debatable what clear in this context actually means. Would the Quran be considered clear?
Some of it is clear, some of it is not clear. So as the Quran itself say, right? And again, it's all about perspective, and something that might not be clear to you now or to us, it could have been clear to people 1400 years ago. So I think I mentioned something very quickly to Derek on his YouTube last month about acronyms. LOL or ROFL. So if you give this to an American, I don't know, 60 years ago, do they understand what ROFL mean? Or LOL? They will never, even though they are English native speakers. We understand. We don't even need to know what these acronyms used for. So take the mysterious letters in the Quran or the disconnected letters. Maybe they meant something for the people 1400 years ago. They didn't ask that many questions about it. They just took it. But then,
what is strange about that is we don't actually have any record of anyone ever asking about those things in the hadith.
We don't. I mean, we have some accounts, and then you have competing traditions, what they could mean, but there's no consensus whatsoever what they really mean. They go from esoteric interpretations into really literal, sometimes mathematical. These letters compose the alphabet of Arabic, and it's a miracle that out of these 27 or 28 letters, Arabic, the Quran is being composed of. You have more than 30 opinions of what they could have meant. But we don't have records of someone going to the Prophet and saying, oh, what does Alif Lam Mim mean? Or ALR? And then he responds clearly. There's nothing. Sound tradition like that. Maybe they understood, maybe they didn't. But the point is, many things could have been clear to them and not clear to us. And vice versa. If you are a believer, if you are a Muslim and you think that the Quran is a book for all ages, maybe there were things that were not clear to them, and then it could become clear to you right now. So it goes both ways. So again, the answer is, some of it clear, some of it is not clear. From a linguistic perspective, the text is clear. It reads in Arabic. If you have training in Arabic, you can understand it. Yes, there are many problematic verses from a syntactical point. Exegetes and scholars tackled that. They have many different interpretations of it. Yes, there are some verses which are problematic because of some grammatical inconsistencies. Maybe there are some mistakes in in copying the text, which resulted in an unusual grammatical reading, but more or less the text reads fine. And just as any text which is written in a high register, like poetry, you read a poem and you would say, well, is the poem clear to you? No one would say that, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I understand all the poem. And the Quran, at the end of the day, it's not poetry, but it is poetic. It's not meant to be an article or an essay. There are many verses which deal with legal issues. They are plain prose. There's even nothing poetic about them. And no one really argues about how clear they are. So it depends which verses, especially early period. Early verses seem to be more cryptic about the day of judgment. I mean, no one can imagine that. So it has to be cryptic.
Yeah, I understand that. The next question would be, I'm trying to kind of tweak this in a way, because I know, based on the conversation that we had so far, the plan kind of changed of my last two questions.
Okay.
But as much as we can answer this question, is the claim that the Quran has no mistakes verifiably true? This is a claim that is made by Muslims in general.
Grammatical mistakes or mistakes, you mean errors?
In its content, in the things that it says, in the claims that it makes,
right?
In the information that it provides, can it be said that in that sense it has no mistakes?
So first aspect, let's talk about syntax or grammatical mistakes. Okay, so this is very. What does a grammatical mistake mean? It means that you have a certain set of grammar or rules of grammar set by whom? By people. People create language, okay? And then you have a text which violates this set of rules. So when the Quran was composed during that period, Arabic grammar was not standardized. So what we consider, or what grammarians 200 years later on considered to be grammatical inconsistencies in the Quran, they of course had different ways of trying to patch this, to say, well, this is according to that Arabic dialect, not to this Arabic dialect, and it could be resolved in this way. So the short answer is yes, there are many grammatical inconsistencies in the Quran if you only take one standardized version of Arabic grammar. Okay. And there are also issues with the copying of the text that resulted probably from, with some inconsistencies because of some scribal errors that happened. Okay. However, because the text more or less is written in a high register of language, okay, it's not, 50% of it is mistakes or 60%. It's, again, I dislike percentages, but there are many cases, but you are talking about 6,200 verses plus. And the problematic verses, I would say, 200, 300. Okay, so that's from the linguistic perspective.
The issue is there's often this understanding, which honestly I am not 100% familiar with,
right.
Which is that the Arabic language is based on the Quran, or the classical Arabic language is based on the Quran, or was formed or shaped by the Quran.
That's a misconception. The Quran is based on Arabic, not the Arabic is based on the Quran.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And again, it's always Quran and Arabic poetry. They were the basis for how Arabic grammar was standardized.
Okay.
Right, but there was Arabic before the Quran.
Okay, and when the Quran is judged based upon the Arabic that existed before the Quran, then you could say that there are certain things within the Quran that are not
correct,
that are not consistent, not perfect. But then again, that depends entirely on
especially when you take the whole tradition of variant readings.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people only now focus mostly on one reading,
Mm-hmm.
but the other 6 or 9 readings, which have many grammatical variations from the standard Arabic, grammarians always recourse to other dialects,
Mm-hmm.
okay, to try to justify this peculiar grammatical anomaly, let's say.
Uh-huh.
Okay. There were treatises even written about, you know, one or two verses which are grammatically completely should be incorrect.
Uh-huh.
If they were written by a person, by a poet, they would go after him. It's like, oh, this is wrong. You don't justify. But because it's the Quran, you have to justify. It cannot be wrong.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
So there cannot be a mistake.
It's impossible to be wrong. There must be an interpretation for it. And this is why grammarians do everything they could to say that this text is justifiable.
That's the main problem that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah. When it comes to the
they don't want
information,
to say it's impossible to say that there's a scribal error. There's no error. God is even inspiring the scribes to write correctly. There are no such thing as a mistake. There's no such thing as scribal error. It's almost, they are not humans. I mean, even computers make mistakes, right? But again, that's the narrative is very different from the early period. You have many voices among Muslim scholars who did say that there are errors, there are mistakes. We did our best to fix the text. God knows best.
Okay.
Move on, right? But that's not how things became lately. Lately, not in the past 10 years, but probably in the past few hundred years, where everything should be perfect. There's no room for error. And that's the issue here.
Even within the first few hundred years, it wasn't theological schools within Islam emerged, and there were the discussions on the nature of the Quran, whether the Quran exactly as it is, as we have it, was indeed authored by Allah before existence, or whether it coexisted with him.
It's a debate until today, people among Muslims. Is the Quran eternal? Is it created? Means is it new? And back to abrogation. If you are saying that there are abrogated verses, so were these verses when they were Quran? They were old, but then they became new. How could you abrogate something that is eternal?
Yeah, I guess we could argue forever about the nature of that.
No, so the point is that people were discussing these things. They were not. They were not, naive to the idea that everything is perfect and everything. No, they knew there were problems, and they wrote books and treatises about them, and they were trying to understand what does it mean that this is the speech of God.
Yeah.
And they debated it, and they never resolved it, and they will never resolve it. Okay, so that's the first. The second question about information, it's very hard to say. Again, what's the role of the Quran? Is it a book that is trying to offer you information? Is it a book that is trying to give you scientific rules? Is it a book that is trying to teach you about the world, or is it a book for liturgical purposes? And again, the role of the Quran as a text changes with time. So I don't think people in the early period were trying to understand the world around them through the lens of the Quran, or trying to find out the speed of light and the density of water through the Quran. This is all later on, later development in a sense.
There is a debate based on the idea which the Quran implies. And for example, at the very beginning, in chapter 2, verse 2, it says, "There is no. This is a book about which there is no doubt."
Right.
In chapter 4, it says something like, "If it were from any other than Allah, you would find within it contradiction."
Right.
So the idea developed.
many contradictions.
Yeah, many contradictions. So the idea developed over time that this is the inspired word, and it is free
Correct.
from flaws, and that suggesting that it has flaws would be equal to disbelief. So there are now two sides of the debate here: that it is entirely perfect and that it has mistakes, and then there might be, of course, the middle ground that what would be the scholarly academic evaluation of this debate? Is it verifiable that the Quran has no mistakes, as it is claimed? Or
I mean, same answer to the beginning of the conversation. It's all about context, when the Quran was revealed, and what you as an academic, what are you trying to achieve? It's again I don't say a meaningless quest to try to, oh well, the Quran says this about the beginning of the universe, and now we know that the beginning of the universe was due to the Big Bang, therefore the Quran is wrong. What do you expect? You expect the Quran 1400 years ago to say the Big Bang started the universe 14 billion years ago? I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, whether it's a revelation or not. I mean, even if you believe it was a revelation, imagine telling a Bedouin in a desert that there's a Big Bang and the speed of light is this, and there are parallel universes and string theory, and it's not going to work out.
Yeah.
Right? So you tell him, you do well, you go to heaven, you drink cold water, and you have lots of milk that doesn't spoil, because always milk spoiled, during that day. So you talk to them in the language they understand. So it's the same thing with all the other misinformation now. Historical inconsistencies, that's another issue. And scholars do work about that, especially theologians. So what does it mean when the Quran say that there are some Jews who say that God has a son? Okay, so
Ezra is the son of Allah.
Right. So scholars are interested in that. So is this a misinformation, or were there really some Judeo-Christian factions in Arabia that really believed that God has a son? Okay. I mean, as far as Judaism goes, I mean, they have no information that there are a faction within Judaism that says God has a son. So why the Quran said that? Is it a misinformation, or was there really a group, a faction that claimed that, right? But I don't think any academic would be interested to say, oh, well, the Quran said that because Muhammad mistranslated a text from the Bible. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But I don't think we are interested in these kind of questions, because we are interested in why the Quran, how the Quran was handling issues back then, and what people believed. Maybe this was something that people believed in, right? And the Quran is just re-emphasizing that, or putting this into context, that there are some Jews who are saying that, but maybe that's what people thought, being misinformed.
Just to have an overview on that example, like the Quran says in chapter 9, verse 30, I believe, it says, Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, and it goes on, how are they deluded? And the suggestion on my end, for example, on the end of critics of Islam, would be that's misinformation, because Jews don't believe that, and we don't know of such Jews who believed that, and even if it was referring to a small group of Jews, the verse wouldn't make much sense. On the other hand, the Muslim position, the believing Muslim position, would be it cannot be wrong, it cannot be false. There is an explanation to it, and we will somehow find this explanation. So we are on these two ends. One side asserting, okay, based on the evidence that we have, the best possible explanation is that it is wrong. The other side says, based on the best possible explanation, that is definitely somehow true. In the middle of this debate, the academic perspective, I guess, would be that it is not verifiable and also not relevant to the.
I'm more interested. Why did the Quran say that? Not whether it's right or wrong. It could be that there were. I mean, it's similar to now. We're saying Muslims say that, but not all Muslims say that, right?
So it would be a futile discussion to go after whether that is true or not, because Yeah. Okay.
So now we will talk about the Quran and preservation and tablets. Say, okay, Muslims think that the Quran is preserved in this manner, but it's not all Muslims. It's 3 or 4% of Muslims who believe that the Quran is the speech of God, sound and letter, etc. The 95% of Muslims don't believe that, right?
Okay. So the
For
general
example,
Muslim belief. Okay. Yeah.
for example, I mean,
Uh-huh.
back to the Quran. Now this is a fact. 95% of Muslims in the past 1400 years, okay, this is the Ash'ari school or the Maturidi school. They don't believe that the Quran, in its sounds and letters, it is the speech of God. It's not, that's not what they believe. Okay, they believe that the speech is something. Okay, but then the actual utterances of the Quran, the sounds and letters, they are not the actual words of God. But then you have the other 3 or 4% of Muslims who believe that the actual sounds and letters are exactly how God pronounced the Quran. Okay, so one could say Muslims believe that, but it's only a fraction of them who believe that. But there are also a huge fraction of them who don't believe in this. So I'm giving you as an example of maybe there was a faction among Judaic Christians in Arabia who believed in that. Maybe not. Maybe there is misinformation. But the more relevant question, at least to me, is why the Quran said that. Okay, was it really a misinformation? Was it mistranslation? Was it a group of Jews who believed in that? But whether it's verifiable or not, we have to rely on Judaic studies to see what factions of groups and most of Jews were available in Arabia at that time, and whether they can verify this information or not. If they can't, I'm more interested in why the Quran said that, not necessarily if it's true or not, at least my perspective.
Yeah, just to clarify an earlier point, when we look at least at Sunni Islam, and when we look at the prevailing schools, the Asharites, the Maturidis, the Atharis, which would make up the vast majority of Muslims that we have today, they disagree on the nature of the speech and the pre-existence and existence of the Quran. But what they do agree on is that the information provided in the Quran, that the Quran we have today, was inspired by Allah.
Correct. All Muslims in all factions, Sunnis, Shias, etc., that the Quran is a revelation from God. That's agreement. Consensus. The disagreement is the huge chunk of Sunni Muslims, the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, right, with the Salafis, let's say, or the Hanbalis, is the nature of the speech of God. Is it sounds of letters, or is it the Arabic sounds of letters, or it is not? So the disagreement until today, and it leads to one faction considering the other faction a disbeliever, and this is among the same Sunni Islam. We're not even talking about other factions. So I'm saying that the vast majority of Muslims, though the Ash'aris, they already solved the issues of grammar, variants, etc., saying that those utterances are not the actual utterances of God. God did not speak those words. But you have the other groups who say, no, he did speak those words as they are. So that's but all of them agree that the Quran is a revelation from God.
I believe,
without a doubt. Yeah.
I'm not sure in which in who this was. One of the significant scholars of theology within Islam, of Aqidah, I believe said something along the lines of the Quran is the revealed word of Allah, and whoever does not add unchanged to it is a disbeliever, or something like that. And
no, I mean it is a valid legal point, but again the problem is what do we mean by unchanged? Is it unchanged that it is altered, or is it the way it's pronounced, it's unchanged? Because we do know for a fact that there are many letters that we pronounce today are very different from how letters were pronounced 1400 years ago. That's a fact in recitation. There are 2 or 3 letters that the way of uttering them or pronouncing them were very different. So what do we mean by unchanged? Is it unaltered, that there's no replacement for one word to another word? But that's also, again, problematic, because we do also know that many companions did replace one word by another.
Mm-hmm.
Synonyms. Ibn Mas'ud, as an example, and this tradition continued for hundreds of years. But then there was a consensus among Muslim scholars in all factions that the Quran is, as we have it today. We don't change any synonym of it. We don't replace one word by another. So I would again ask, what do we mean by unchanged?
The change of Ibn Masud, was it in reciting the Quran that a synonym of a specific
Reciting,
word
not just
okay.
You have now a trend. They say, well, this was only a tafsir or
Mm-hmm.
exegesis, trying to interpret it, but it's not. There are a few examples of this, but it was a recitation. It was public recitation, and there are tons of narrations and the sources that this was in his codex.
Mm-hmm.
People were reciting in Ibn Mas'ud's recitation in Iraq for at least 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there are transmissions on that. So it is public liturgical recitation, and not just a work on grammar, let's say, or interpretation or tafsir. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, I think we're very much through with the questions that we have. I want to ask one final question, which might be, I guess, hard at this point to answer. Just very briefly, based on the concept of best possible explanations, what would be the best answer, in your professional opinion, to the question, who wrote or who authored the Quran?
As a person, or a person, I mean, it's back to the original question. If you believe, you would say that it's a revelation. If you don't believe, it's Muhammad who wrote it. It's as simple as that. It's very difficult to say. I mean, even from if you take a Muslim perspective on that, it's a very difficult question. Okay, well, it's a revelation from God, but it's not the actual letters and sounds. It's only the syntax. Mm-hmm. Okay, the arrangement, the syntax. What about the utterances? What about the case endings, the grammar? So my answer would be the composition, the actual composition is done by an entity. If you believe in God and Islam, it's God who composed it, okay? Mm-hmm. If you don't believe, it's Muhammad or a person. Consistently writing this work in this composition. However, the book as a whole, it was arranged, edited, recited, polished over decades and even centuries by the community.
Okay.
Right? So the way that the Quran is recited, we can easily verify through our sources that styles of recitation developed over time. Mm-hmm. They were not the way that you hear now the Quran. It's highly improbable that this is how they were reciting it 1400 years ago, mm-hmm, with the complex rules of recitation and how grammar developed. So it's very difficult to say, well, this text was composed by this person and it is as we have it today, it is as we have it before. It took really at least hundreds of years to reach this kind of stage, and it was done by the efforts of scholars, of linguists, of theologians over the centuries. So hopefully we will find a time machine in the future. We go back, and then I mean, even if you say that Muhammad composed it as someone who doesn't believe, it's still interesting to see how the process was.
Definitely, yeah. Definitely.
The differences between the early period, the later period, how he was reciting it, how people were reacting to it, what kind of changes that happened through his life over the 23 years that he was preaching. that led to this. The repetition. They have so many repetitive verses in the Quran. Were they really repeated because of the copying process, or was it really repeated during the course of revelation? You have many chunks of verses and stories repeated over and over and over. So this repetition is a sign of orality. You don't have this kind of repetition in a composed work. So that's again one argument against people, or against the group of people who say, well, the Quran was a composed text at a certain point of time. Repetition is a sign of orality. 99%, let's say, not 100%. You don't have someone who's sitting down and writing something, and then you keep repeating the phrase all over the Quran. I'm not just talking about one chapter. So the composition, the arrangement, it's very peculiar, and it's really almost an impossible question to answer. Who composed it based on the tools that we have today?
Yep. If I were to sit down today and write a book that is aimed to be considered a well-written book by and evaluated by scholars and by readers as a good readable book, if I want to increase the readability of the book, then I would write a book that where the content is properly organized and put into a line of thoughts, separated chapter for chapter, and in which many.
Otherwise, they will not publish your work. They will reject it. So, but again, the standards of publication today are very different from the standards 1400 years ago. Maybe your book that you are writing today, if you publish it 1400 years ago, no one will read it. Maybe. Because they don't want something to be that organized. I mean, it took some time to get this kind of organization. And this is a feature in Islamic / Arabic books in general, is that authors jump from one topic to another and they repeat things. Many books were dictated. I'm talking about theological books and even books of exegesis. They were, you have a scholar who is dictating that to his students. He's not sitting on his desk and writing. Sometimes they do, but most of the time they dictate. And because of this process of dictation, there are many repetitions throughout the work.
Yeah, when I think about, when I look at, I'm kind of dragging the conversation right now, but
no worries.
When I look at lists of best books ever written in terms of their literary aspects, for example, and I look at the oldest available books that we have, whether they're complete or not, or if we take the Iliad, or if we take the ancient Greek books that form a sort of a foundation of literature over thousands of years, we see that
of Western literature.
Western. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yes, nice correction. Of Western literature, we would see that. We would consider them well written and well organized because they were done deliberately by standards that we very much respect today, and very much
again by Western standards.
By Western standards today. If we compare the Quran, for example, to that, we would not say, okay, this book was organized with the same ideas and the same intentions and the same understandings of.
Not at all. And that's one of the challenges we have in teaching the Quran in Western universities. Students don't get it. They are not used to this kind of arrangement. You can't tell someone. There's a wonderful article when I do the literature class on speaking of standards of literature, Western literature and Arabic literature. The author talks about saliva, how the Arab poet always loves to taste the saliva of his beloved. That's gross in Western standards. You don't have this kind of metaphor, but Arab poets love that. This is the standards of beauty for an Arab woman in poetry is a plump woman. They don't like skinny women. It's plump woman who's well fed, who's lazy, who's just waiting in the tent, not working. That's the standards. They didn't like working women. It means that they didn't come from good families.
Oh,
right. So a good woman who comes from a noble clan or noble tribe, she's plump, she's well-fed. That's the standards. So standards. So it's really. I don't want to say difficult, but it leads you to different results when you're trying to compare a work from just not Western. Same with Chinese standards. I mean, Chinese literature, again, is another beast. Or East Asian, they have different standards for poetry and religious texts than the Middle East, than the West.
Well, one example that I can bring up myself, the Tao Te Ching is considered one of the most respectable books in human history, and I read it myself, and it's very impressive in the knowledge that it gives. But if you read the book through, it's like by Western standards, it's a very strangely organized book. For example,
even I remember my friend, he always has a funny comment on Chinese paintings. Okay, and we know that the Chinese are very good at handcraft and painting, but he's comparing it to medieval Italian art. And he said, look, we have this, he's speaking as a Western, but the Chinese is always a bird on a branch. It's always the same bird on a branch in many, so you see how his Western mind is thinking, but the Chinese doesn't think this way. It's every bird on a branch in a different portrait is different from another bird on another branch. It tells a different story. But for Western art perspective, same with Arabic art perspective. Arabs didn't go into paintings and sculpting. They went into calligraphy and architecture, whether it's for theological reasons or not, but they have different aesthetics. And same goes with the Quran and with literature. It's just different aesthetics. Separate verses from chapters. You only need to know the verses separate from their context. Same with poetry. You of course you can memorize a whole poem, but it's enough sometimes if you want to cite an example, you just take one line or two lines out of context and then use it. It's a different way how the mind works from one culture to another. So
I really have a question that I'm tempted to ask right now. I know we are through the questions and all that, but yeah. I don't even know. We basically talked about this, but does it make sense to assert that the Quran is a book of universal? That the Quran is a universal book. I don't know. I don't even know how to ask the question, but you know what I mean. That's. I
mean that it's sent to it. We can use it everywhere, anytime. It's sent for everyone. That's what it says.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I can't form the question to make it sense in the best way right now. But that the Quran would be considered universally authoritative and valuable. And
again, see, the devil is in the details. So this is why we like definitions, right? I mean, even when Muslim scholars are trying to talk about the Quran, they first define the Quran, because you can define it in so many different ways. We think that, this is the book that you can buy from the shelf on a bookstore, but in theological terms, it has a very different definition. Same with the universal. So what do we mean by universal? Is it that the laws are applicable everywhere? But we know that even from Islamic history, that's not the case, because even within Islamdom, if you say, you have different legal schools, and each school follows customs in their region. So the people in Iraq were following, I don't want to say completely different laws from North Africa, but they had very significant differences in applicability of laws. So is it universally in terms of laws, in terms of, I don't know, theology, monotheism? I don't know. So if you give me a checklist, what do we mean by universal? At least I can talk about it from the perspective of theologians, how they thought about it.
I'm fascinated by this discussion. I really love it. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
You're welcome. No, my pleasure. Hopefully, I didn't digress much. And
no, it was beautiful. It was brilliant. I would love to have more discussions with you. I believe you have authority on in terms of Near Eastern studies, in terms of Islamic civilization, early Islamic history.
Allegedly, yes. Uh-huh.
Okay. I bet we could have further conversations. We can probably follow up with that. But
Sure. Yeah.
I would love to have you back sometime
Yeah,
and
no problem.
explore
So
more in the future.
I'm happy always to talk with people, answer questions to the best of my ability, and explain things. And no problem. When I come back from my leave, go back to my headquarters, I'm always happy to continue the conversation. No problem at all.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Shady Nasser. Is there anything else that you want to add before?
No, that's all. Take care, and hopefully it works out. And good luck with everything. If you have questions about these things or other things, feel free to be in touch. So
okay, awesome. Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for watching. See you again soon, and have a fantastic day. Bye.
Yes, cheers. Bye bye.